Joe Louis was more than a heavyweight champion. He was discipline carved into muscle, silence sharpened into power. In an era when America needed a symbol it could rally behind, Joe Louis stood in the center of the ring and carried a nation on his shoulders without ever raising his voice. His fists spoke clearly enough. His victories felt inevitable. His composure looked unbreakable. But greatness has a shadow. And behind the calm face of the brown bomber lived a ledger of names he never erased. Joe Louis was taught to win quietly, to bow politely, to absorb pressure without complaint. He understood that his role went beyond boxing. Every fight was a test of identity, politics, and control. Every step toward the ring came with expectations heavier than any title belt. What the public never saw was the private cost. The long nights in locker rooms where respect felt conditional. The headlines that turned opponents into enemies before a punch was ever thrown. The sense that some men were not trying to beat him, but to define him. There were rivals who challenged his crown. Others challenged his dignity. Some never faced him across the ropes at all, yet left scars deeper than any cut above the eye. These were not simple sporting grudges. They were collisions of ego and power, moments when two storms met under the boxing ring lights and neither side could step back. For decades, Joe Louis kept those feelings locked away. He did what champions of his generation were expected to do. He endured. He moved on. He let history simplify the story. But silence does not erase memory. And memory, when carried long enough, becomes weight. Tonight, that silence breaks. Not with accusations, not with anger, but with truth. 6 names stand at the center of his story. 6 men who shaped his career in ways the record books never fully captured. 6 encounters that left marks no championship could cover. Who were the rivals that defined his career, and which name will shock you the most? Joe Louis did not rise like other champions. There was no loud entrance, no hunger for spectacle, no desire to dominate headlines. His greatness came quietly, built through repetition, discipline, and an almost mechanical sense of control. In the ring, he looked calm even when chaos surrounded him. Outside of it, he carried himself with restraint that bordered on silence. Born into poverty and shaped by hardship, Joe Louis entered boxing at a time when America was searching for stability and reassurance. He became exactly that. Not just a champion, but a figure people believed in. When he fought, factories slowed down. Radios stayed on. Entire neighborhoods leaned forward together. His victories felt personal to millions who had never thrown a punch in their lives. Yet that public image came with invisible rules. Joe Louis was expected to win, but never to boast, to dominate, but never to humiliate, to represent strength, but never anger. He was praised when he followed the script and quietly corrected when he did not. Over time, that pressure shaped him into something both powerful and constrained, a man celebrated by a nation, yet carefully managed by it. Inside the boxing world, he was respected and feared. His punching combinations were precise and unforgiving. His timing dismantled opponents before they understood what was happening. Many challengers entered the ring believing they had a chance. Most left knowing they had faced something inevitable. But dominance does not mean freedom. Behind the titles and defenses, Joe Louis learned that control often belongs to those standing outside the ropes. As years passed, his name grew larger than his body could sustain. He gave more than he took. He fought longer than he should have. He stayed silent when speaking might have protected him, and slowly, the legend began to carry weight heavier than any opponent. This is the Joe Louis the record books rarely describe, not just the champion, but the man navigating loyalty, pressure, and resentment in a sport that rewards power but often exploits it. And it is from this place that his unspoken grudges begin to make sense. Number 6. Primo Carnera. When Joe Louis prepared to face Primo Carnera, the fight already felt heavier than any championship bout. Carnera was not just a towering heavyweight from Italy. He was a symbol carefully shaped by power far beyond the ropes. Newspapers framed him as an unstoppable giant, a continental force, a man whose victories echoed political pride overseas. In the locker rooms, fighters whispered that this match was no longer about rankings or belts. It was about what each man represented when the lights came on. Joe Louis felt that weight immediately. The atmosphere around the fight was thick with meaning. Cameras lingered longer. Headlines grew sharper. Every movement was scrutinized as if the ring itself had become a stage for something larger than sport. Louis understood that he was being positioned not only as a challenger, but as a counter-image. Calm against spectacle, control against size, discipline against manufactured myth. Even before the bell rang, the tension was already cutting into him. When they finally collided, it felt like witnessing two storms meeting under the boxing ring lights. Carnera pressed forward with raw mass and momentum, trying to overwhelm by presence alone. Louis responded with precision that looked almost cold. Each punch was placed, not thrown. Each step backward was measured, not fearful. The clash was violent, but controlled. It was not chaos. It was correction. As the rounds unfolded, the difference became undeniable. Louis was not fighting a man so much as dismantling an illusion. Every clean hit stripped away the idea that size and symbolism could replace skill and authority. When the end came, it was decisive. The crowd saw a victory. The record books logged a result. But inside Joe Louis, something else settled in. He never forgot how that fight made him feel. Not because of Carnera's punches, but because of the role he was forced to play. He had been pulled into a narrative he never asked for, turned into a counterweight in someone else's story. The resentment did not burn hot. It stayed quiet, steady, and enduring. Carnera became the first reminder that some battles are chosen for you long before you step into the ring. Number 5. Max Schmeling. Joe Louis never intended to hate Max Schmeling. In the beginning, Schmeling was simply another opponent, another skilled heavyweight with a sharp mind and a patient style. But the moment Louis lost to him, everything changed. That defeat did not stay inside the ropes. It escaped into headlines, speeches, and national pride. Almost overnight, Schmeling stopped being a boxer and became a symbol the world argued over. The build-up to their first fight was deceptive. Louis was young, dominant, and widely considered unbeatable. The locker room atmosphere reflected confidence that bordered on inevitability. Reporters treated the bout as a formality. Schmeling, however, watched quietly. He studied patterns, waited for mistakes, and prepared for a moment others believed would never come. When the upset happened, it felt like the ground shifted beneath boxing itself. For Joe Louis, the loss cut deeper than embarrassment. The press did not frame it as a tactical failure. They framed it as a shock to American strength. Schmeling's victory was immediately politicized, pulled into narratives far beyond sport. Louis felt the weight settle on him fast. He was no longer fighting for himself. He was expected to correct history. The rematch became something else entirely. Training camps tightened. Conversations grew colder. There was no room for doubt. When the two men finally met again, it felt like witnessing two storms colliding under the boxing ring lights. Schmeling entered calm and calculated, knowing exactly what he faced. Louis entered controlled but relentless, carrying pressure that had nowhere to go except forward. The fight ended quickly, brutally, and decisively. Punches landed with purpose, not rage. Each combination erased the memory of the first loss in real time. The crowd erupted, but Joe Louis did not celebrate. He walked back to the locker room with the same reserved expression. The victory restored his standing, but it did not erase what had been taken from him. Schmeling remained tied to that moment forever, not because of personal cruelty, but because he represented a loss of control Joe Louis never forgot. The hatred was not loud. It was quiet, shaped by memory and expectation. Schmeling became proof that one night can follow a man for a lifetime. Number 4. Billy Conn. Billy Conn did not look like a threat when he first stepped into Joe Louis' orbit. He was smaller, lighter, and came from a division most heavyweights barely acknowledged. The early talk framed him as a curiosity, a clever boxer with speed and confidence, but not a real danger. In training rooms and press briefings, his name was mentioned with a half smile. Joe Louis heard that tone. He understood exactly what it meant. The build-up to their fight shifted as the weeks passed. Conn spoke with ease, sometimes too much of it. Reporters loved him. He was articulate, sharp, and willing to question the inevitability of Louis' reign. Headlines began to paint the match as a test of intelligence versus force. In the locker room, Louis felt the mood change. Respect was being replaced by speculation. For a champion who had spent years maintaining control and order, that speculation felt like provocation. When the bell rang, the difference in styles was immediate. Khan moved like a man playing chess at full speed. He darted in and out, landed clean shots, and refused to stay in one place long enough to be punished. Round after round, he stayed competitive. In some moments, he looked dangerous. For the first time in years, Joe Louis was forced to adjust rather than impose. It felt like witnessing two storms colliding under the boxing ring lights. One storm was disciplined and heavy, built on structure and inevitability. The other was fast and unpredictable, fueled by confidence that bordered on defiance. As the fight wore on, tension tightened around the ring. The idea that Khan could pull off the impossible grew louder with every passing minute. Then it ended. Khan made a choice that sealed his fate. He stood his ground instead of escaping. Joe Louis responded the only way he knew how. The counter came clean, precise, and final. The fight turned in an instant, and the illusion vanished. Louis never forgave the feeling that followed, not because Khan had nearly beaten him, but because he had been forced to confront vulnerability in public. Khan represented the danger of being underestimated and the insult of being questioned. Even in victory, that resentment lingered. Some challenges leave marks not because they succeed, but because they come too close. Number 3. Dan Topping. Dan Topping never threw a punch at Joe Louis, yet few men left deeper marks. By the time Louis returned from military service, the world had changed. The roar of the crowds was still there, but it carried a different tone. The champion was no longer just a fighter. He was a public asset, a symbol to be used, scheduled, and displayed. Topping stood at the center of that machinery. In post-war America, exhibitions and charity events multiplied. Baseball owners, promoters, and executives sought familiar faces to draw crowds and goodwill. Joe Louis was perfect for it. He carried trust. He carried memory. He carried the weight of a nation's gratitude. In locker rooms and back offices, deals were discussed quickly, often without Louis fully understanding the long-term cost. Topping represented a world where handshake agreements and polished smiles concealed obligation. The press framed these appearances as honor, as duty, as patriotism. But behind the headlines, Louis felt something eroding. His body was aging, his finances were fragile, and yet the requests never slowed. Topping and men like him knew Louis would not say no easily. They knew silence had always been part of his discipline. What began as respect slowly became expectation. The conflict never erupted in public. There were no shouting matches or dramatic confrontations. Instead, it unfolded quietly through contracts, scheduling pressure, and financial entanglements. Louis found himself returning to the ring not because he wanted to compete, but because the system demanded it. Each appearance chipped away at his autonomy. Each obligation tightened the net. It felt like witnessing two storms colliding under the boxing ring lights, except this storm happened outside the ropes. On one side stood a champion defined by restraint and loyalty. On the other stood power structures that valued image over longevity. The punches were invisible, but their impact was lasting. Fatigue accumulated, injuries lingered, the joy of fighting disappeared. Joe Louis never forgot how trapped he felt during that period. Dan Topping became a symbol of a broader betrayal, not personal cruelty, but calculated indifference. The realization that even legends could be managed, leveraged, and exhausted. Some men fight you openly. Others win by waiting until you no longer have the strength to resist. Number 2. Ezzard Charles. By the time Joe Louis stepped into the ring with Ezzard Charles, the fight had already been decided in ways no training camp could change. The seasons behind him were long and demanding. Years of title defenses, military service, and forced returns had taken their toll. The locker room no longer felt like a place of anticipation. It felt like obligation. Louis knew it, even if he refused to say it out loud. Ezzard Charles arrived from a different world. He was calm, analytical, and unsentimental. Where Louis represented an era built on authority and inevitability, Charles embodied transition. He studied angles, conserved energy, and never rushed. The press framed him as respectful, but respect did not soften the reality. This was a younger man facing a legend whose body had already paid its price. When the fight unfolded, the contrast was unmistakable. Charles did not try to overwhelm. He waited, circled, and picked moments carefully. Joe Louis still had power, still had timing, but the gaps were there now. The exchanges felt slower. The reactions came a fraction too late. It felt like witnessing two storms colliding under the boxing ring lights, one driven by memory and will, the other by patience and inevitability. The defeat was not violent. That made it worse. There was no single punch to blame, no moment of chaos to point toward. Instead, the loss unfolded methodically, round by round, like time itself asserting control. When the decision was announced, the silence around Joe Louis was heavier than any crowd reaction. He understood what the result meant. Not just a loss, but confirmation. Louis never truly hated Ezzard Charles as a person. The resentment ran deeper and darker than that. Charles became the mirror Joe Louis did not want to face. Proof that discipline and legacy cannot negotiate with age. Proof that the sport he had ruled would continue without him. In that sense, Charles represented something unforgivable. Not betrayal, not disrespect, but finality. Some opponents challenge your strength, others challenge your identity. Ezzard Charles did both without saying a word, and for Joe Louis, that quiet realization cut deeper than any punch he had ever taken. Number 1. Jack Kearns. Jack Kearns was not the loudest man in boxing, but he was one of the most dangerous. He understood something Joe Louis learned too late. Power in this sport does not always belong to the strongest fighter. Often, it belongs to the man who writes the contracts, controls the schedules, and decides when a career should continue or end. Kearns lived comfortably in that space, far from the ropes, where damage is inflicted quietly. By the time Joe Louis reached his peak, the machinery around him was already in motion. Managers, promoters, and advisors circled constantly. They spoke the language of opportunity and legacy, but beneath it ran a current of calculation. Kearns represented that world perfectly, a man who knew how to attach himself to greatness and extract value long after the public applause faded. In locker rooms and private meetings, Louis began to sense that decisions were being made without him truly being present. The pressure was subtle but relentless. Fight dates appeared when rest was needed. Financial obligations grew heavier with every defense. Promises of protection dissolved into fine print. Joe Louis, disciplined and loyal by nature, trusted that the system would reward his sacrifices. Instead, it tightened its grip. Kearns and men like him understood that a champion's silence is often their greatest vulnerability. The real conflict never unfolded in front of cameras. It happened through contracts that extended careers beyond reason, through financial arrangements that left Louis perpetually indebted, through the quiet expectation that he would always give more than he took. When Louis returned to the ring in his later years, it was not hunger that drove him, it was obligation. That obligation carried a name. It felt like witnessing two storms colliding under the boxing ring lights, except one storm never stepped into the ring. Joe Louis fought opponents with fists and courage. Kearns fought with time, leverage, and patience. The damage accumulated slowly, invisibly, until escape was no longer possible. By the end, Louis realized the cruel truth. The most painful blows of his career did not come from challengers chasing his title. They came from the structure that claimed to protect him. Jack Kearns became the embodiment of everything Joe Louis could not forgive. Not a single betrayal, but a lifetime of quiet exploitation. The understanding that greatness does not guarantee safety, that even legends can be owned, managed, and discarded. Some rivalries end with the final bell. This one followed Joe Louis long after the lights went out. Joe Louis never lived as a man driven by hatred. That is what makes these 6 names so revealing. They were not collected through anger or obsession, but through endurance. Each one marked a moment when his control was tested, his silence exploited, or his identity reshaped by forces larger than the ring. Together, they tell a story far more complex than wins and losses. In the public memory, Joe Louis stands frozen as the perfect champion, calm, disciplined, unshakable. But perfection often hides cost. To remain that symbol, he learned to absorb pressure without response, to accept narratives written by others, to fight when expected and retreat when instructed. Over time, that discipline became a cage. The grudges he carried were not signs of weakness. They were evidence of awareness. What unites these rivalries is not cruelty or malice. It is imbalance. Moments when Joe Louis gave more than he received. Moments when respect turned into expectation, and expectation hardened into obligation. Some opponents challenged his body. Others challenged his dignity. The most damaging challenged his freedom. None of them were easily confronted, and most could not be defeated with fists alone. Joe Louis's life reminds us that greatness does not protect you from exploitation. It can invite it. The same qualities that made him beloved made him manageable. His silence, once admired, became a tool others learned to use. By the time he recognized the full weight of that truth, the ledger was already written. In the end, Joe Louis was not defined by who he hated, but by what he endured without breaking. These 6 names are not stains on his legacy. They are shadows cast by it. And perhaps the final lesson he leaves behind is this. In boxing, as in life, the most dangerous opponents are not always the ones standing across from you. Sometimes, they are the ones deciding how long you are allowed to stand at all.